I grew up in Australia, in a fairly rural area, on a cow farm. My favourite memories of being on the farm was spending time with my father on Saturday mornings. I had two younger brothers who were both asthmatics, so they didn't spend time out on the farm, which made spending time with my dad more special to me. That was the only one-on-one time that I got to spend with him.
Andrew Facey, Brooklyn's father, is a wealthy fourth-generation real estate developer in Melbourne.
When I was a kid, I thought my dad was a superhero. He took over his father's real estate business when he was 18 years old, and he expanded the business very significantly.
Brooklyn's mother is a beautiful socialite.
I had a very difficult relationship with my mother. There was the expectation that I was going to be as thin and as beautiful as what she was. And it didn't seem to matter what I did. It was never good enough for her. And it's caused a significant amount of trauma in my life.
Brooklyn wants to follow in her father's footsteps one day, but here too, she meets with rejection.
My intention was to take over the family business, but my father is somewhat old school in that he likes to keep the men in the business and the women at home.
Her dad does agree to support her financially, and Brooklyn sets her sights on college. But then, disaster strikes.
When I was 18 years old, I had a head-on collision with a truck. I had a closed head injury, my face and jaw was smashed, and I have since had 54 orthopedic surgeries to rebuild my body. I spent most of the year either in a wheelchair or on crutches, but I managed to get through that year at college.
Brooklyn eventually finishes her degree, but rethinks her future.
I couldn't spend time standing and on my feet all day, which is what's required if you're in real estate. One of the things that interested me was esthetician. So I did a course in that, and then I opened my own business in a gym in Melbourne. I met my first husband at the gym after one of the surgeries. After my car accident, I felt like I had been smashed into pieces, and I felt that nobody was going to want me. So as soon as somebody did come along that appeared interested in me, I feel like I kind of latched onto that.
The couple marry in 1996 when Brooklyn is 27, and she gives birth to her first son a year later.
By the time I was pregnant with my second son, I was working and I had a toddler, and my patience with my husband was really just running low. I said to him, "You're gonna have to go because you're not pulling your weight."
After 5 years of marriage, Brooklyn takes full custody of her sons with minimal resistance from her ex. A year later, she's ready to dip her toes back into the dating pool.
For anyone who's been a single mother, it's an exhausting gig. And I hoped that I would find someone who would come in and be a part of the family and contribute to that. So I signed up for an Australian dating online service.
She met Paul Carter on RSVP, the online dating site. He came across to her as very available. He was single, unmarried, without children, and looking for love.
So the next night I went on my first date with Paul Carter. And that was a date with destiny, to say the least. Paul showed up in a bright yellow sports car, and that epitomized Paul's personality. He was flashy, he was showy. We went out for dinner and we laughed and talked and got on great, and he was just very easy to talk to, and we just kind of clicked. He has a big personality and he is an amusing person to spend time with.
Paul is ambitious and has his sights set on a bright financial future as a real estate developer and independent business owner.
I needed a man that was going to step up, somebody that had the sort of alpha male qualities that my dad had. That's how Paul came across initially. We got romantically involved pretty quickly from that point. I had come from being married to somebody who was really not physically interested in me at all. And he was this guy, he was very sexual and a great lover. And I appealed to him. That made me feel great.
Eventually, Brooklyn introduces her sons to Paul.
My middle son was about 18 months old, and my eldest son was about 4. And he got along great with them, and he was happy to play with them and spend time with them, and so they thought he was great.
For 6 months, the four are spending all of their weekend time together. Eventually, work intervenes, and Paul says he has to focus on some business matters.
He says that he can't see me this weekend. Okay, that's fine, no problem. I thought it was because he was trying to get stuff done. I ended up going to the South Melbourne market, and I'm wandering around the market, and I look up, and here's Paul walking towards me, hand in hand, with a girl that I had no idea who she was. And he couldn't get her to let go of his hand fast enough. And I said to him, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just showing so-and-so around Melbourne. She's here visiting from Canada." And I couldn't even think at that point. Like, I couldn't think of anything to say. I was left standing there like an idiot, in shock. And when I finally got to ask him about it, his explanation was, "Oh, I was holding her hand because she was scared. She was scared." He claims that she just showed up unannounced. Nobody flies from Canada to Australia on a whim. I'm not somebody that strings people out or plays games, so I wasn't at that time familiar with being played the way that he was playing me. I started to get suspicious. I couldn't understand why I was never invited to his place. So one day when he was in the shower, I pulled his driver's license from his wallet and got his address. His name on his driver's license was Paul Carter, but the address didn't really fit with the narrative that he was putting up about being this super successful guy and having all these designer brands and this flashy car. And I thought, okay, well, I'll go pay a visit and see what's going on at this house. I pull up to the house and I knocked on the door, and this older man, Paul's dad, answered the door. And I said, "Is Paul Carter here?" And he said, "Do you mean Paul Cristallo?" And I said, "No, Paul Carter. This is his address." He said, "Well, Paul Cristallo lives here with his wife, Sonia, and he has 3 kids from his previous marriage." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was surreal. I have 2 little boys who are becoming quite attached to him. And there was a sideboard just inside the door, and it had all these photos from their wedding, the pictures of the kids, pictures of his wife. And I felt like the ground was going to open up and swallow me.
Brooklyn Facey is reeling from the news that her new boyfriend, Paul Carter, is not the successful single man he claims to be. In fact, he's married with kids.
This was his second marriage that he was in. At that point, the first marriage, he had 3 kids. And he has a different last name. At this point, I'm starting to wonder if anything about him is real.
Brooklyn decides to confront Paul, who simply shrugs it off.
He says, yes, I'm married, but we're separated and we're just living in the house together. It didn't sound unrealistic. I thought, this guy's got a lot of potential. He was an exciting person. He's not boring like my last husband was. In hindsight, I should have just stuck with boring.
After the painful confrontation, Paul divorces his second wife and moves into an apartment. And soon, the deception is in the rear view as he plays dad to a blended family with Brooklyn.
He had 3 young children, I had 2 young children. Their ages sort of meshed together. Every other weekend, we had all 5 of them. I loved having the kids there. It was a lot of work for sure, but my boys were happy to have playmates. Thought Paul was pretty good with helping with things around the house, and he was involved in everything that they were doing. So we had a pretty good team situation going on. It meant a great deal to me because I was looking for a partner.
In March 2003, 8 months after first meeting Paul, he surprises Brooklyn with a grand gesture.
Paul proposed to me at the beach. He got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. I was thrilled. I was so excited. He convinced me that the life that we were going to have together was going to be wonderful. I didn't really get a sense that my parents didn't like him until I said to them that we were getting married, and they were not in favor of the idea. Right from the get-go, my father thought Paul was sketchy and he couldn't put his finger on it. But, you know, I was an adult. I was in my 30s by that stage, and I was going to do what I was going to do. So we got married on St Kilda Beach in Melbourne. My father came to the wedding. My mother did not come to the wedding. We had all the kids there, all dressed up in black pants and white shirts, and it was so beautiful. And everything seemed so perfect that day. I finally felt like I had the family that I had not had for my whole life. And I was the mother in the family, and I was never going to let my kids feel lonely or sad or unloved. Just thought that was the beginning of the happily ever after. So after we got married, the first couple of years were kind of rough. I was dealing with chronic pain from my car accident, but I felt like Paul had my back. I felt like he was there for me. For the most part, he seemed to be on my team.
The couple doesn't have to worry about money. Brooklyn may be cut out of running the family business, but her dad is still supportive. They move into a bigger house, and when she starts feeling healthier, they take another big step.
We decided to have a child together, and we had Mac, who is the love of my life, and he is my heart and soul.
After Mac's birth, Brooklyn and Paul buy an outdoor equipment company to run as a family business.
I was hoping that it would be something that we could work together in, and then there would be like a legacy for our kids. I was working there part-time, and I was doing the books, and Paul was selling the items, and he was very creative with his marketing, and he would start selling things on eBay. My dad injected a very significant amount of money so we could try and, make a go of it. He was trying to protect me financially, and he wanted to help Paul create something that was going to be good for us.
But after 18 months, they don't have enough cash flow to replenish their stock.
Paul was spending more money than he was bringing in. It wasn't until he was working for something that I was involved in that I got a glimpse of his poor business practices. and my dad basically bailed us out of it. So once we lost the company, my dad then had that over me. And I was going to hear about that forever and a day, that he had saved me and that otherwise we would have been bankrupt. Paul really did a good job of putting a wedge between us.
In 2010, Paul was appointed the CEO of United Housing Victoria, which is a publicly funded community housing company, and there he ran big sort of multi-million-dollar construction jobs.
The organization provides housing for low-income families.
He manages to pull this great job with United Housing, a very secure job, paying very well, and I'm thinking, great, everything's back on track now. I had no idea that he was doing anything wrong at the time.
He was let go after 2 years because they saw they were just hemorrhaging money. The suspicion was that Paul was blowing out the contracts of these construction jobs and pocketing that money.
Brooklyn and Paul have huge mortgage payments for the house they own together, and their debts are mounting because of Paul's excessive spending.
I was panic-stricken, and Paul's way of placating me was to say, I'll just pick up extra jobs on the side. We were in a bad place in our marriage. We ended up having to sell the house. My dad was furious. He was telling me that Paul doesn't know what he's doing. I was humiliated, totally humiliated. The fact that Paul was so irresponsible with money was another reason that my dad felt that he was not a good influence on the boys and that they would be better off with their biological father. He was putting pressure on my ex-husband. My father said to him, I will pay for your lawyers and I will put the kids through school. They took me to court and they filed for custody of my sons.
The custody battle continues for 3 years.
I had run out of money for lawyers. I had no chance of winning. No chance.
Finally, in 2013, Brooklyn loses custody of her 2 oldest sons, who are now 12 and 15. Perhaps influenced by their grandfather, they choose to side with their father.
So my ex-husband, he allowed my father to do this, and he really hasn't worked a day since then. There's only one thing that I really take pride in, and that is that I think I'm a good mum. And for me to lose my kids like that was just so devastating. If it wasn't for Mac, it would have been the end of me.
But for Brooklyn, these losses are just the beginning. Brooklyn Carter is staggering from the heartbreaking loss of her custody battle.
My family, I have no connection with because they've all taken my dad's side. I've lost 2 of my sons, so all I have left is my youngest son and my husband. It would have been easier for me if I had died that day. Everything that I had tried to keep safe and everything that mattered to me had just been handed over to someone else. And I just hope that when my boys are older, they realize that I never, ever stopped loving them. For a long time, I was so focused on the court battle with my kids that I was not paying attention to my husband. He felt that he was missing out on time and energy that I should have been putting into him. He was going to motocross meetings and joining motocross clubs. He was buying cars and changing cars frequently.
Paul would use Brooklyn to subsidize his lifestyle, things like fast cars, properties, credit cards.
There was constant stress in the house. Bills needed to be paid.
Brooklyn has managed to protect a portion of her nest egg from Paul's spending, but she's concerned he might eventually drain all of her money.
I really didn't have a lot of options other than to take back control myself. And my version of that was to take my money and put it somewhere else where Paul couldn't touch it, and I knew it would be safe. So we got an E2 treaty visa, which is granted to Australians who invest into a business in the United States. We had been to Boston to visit, and I loved it there. So I bought a couple of houses and rented them out.
Coincidentally, just as Brooklyn ties up her finances with offshore real estate and her money is out of his reach, Paul comes into a windfall.
On my son Mac's 5th birthday, we were having a party at our house for him, and Paul announced to me that he had inherited a large plot of land from his grandmother, and the government were trying to buy that land because they wanted to put a highway through.
Paul explains that this land is in Italy, and the sale is slightly delayed by red tape.
He showed me some documentation, and it all looked very bona fide to me, which was incredibly exciting because he was telling me that it was worth tens of millions of dollars. And that's one of the things about Paul. He always bounces back, often bigger and better than he was before.
Brooklyn feels hope for the first time since losing custody of her oldest sons. But she's worried how their absence is affecting Mac, her youngest.
It was very difficult for my youngest son to come home every night and not have his brothers there, and go to the same school and not see his brothers.
Brooklyn suggests to Paul that they move to Boston.
By this stage, he was working for himself as a builder, and he had various projects underway. He said, okay, great, we'll buy houses, renovate them and flip them and start a new life.
Brooklyn and Mac head to Boston in April of 2014.
I was still devastated about my sons, but it was easier to try and move forward when I wasn't faced with the same things every day that reminded me of them. So Mac and I are in Boston. He was happy, I was happy, and we were expecting that Paul would join us within 2, maybe 3 months. Then suddenly the communication starts to dwindle and he's not calling every day. He didn't contact me for my birthday. It didn't take long for me to question him about what was going on. So he says to me, I would finish these jobs a lot quicker if you can fund them, and then once I finish them, I'll get the final payment and then I'll repay you.
Brooklyn knows that lending money to Paul is a risk, but after 11 years of marriage, she doesn't want to give up on him.
I don't like quitters, and I don't like to quit on things myself. I'm gonna stick with something until the very end. So I went ahead and gave him the money.
It won't be long before Brooklyn discovers the real purpose of the money.
It was the middle of the night, and I was woken up by Mac, who was then 8 years old, who had his iPad in his hand. So he hands me his iPad and says, who is this lady in the picture with Dad? Somebody had sent him a Facebook notification. Hang on, is this an old picture of Paul? This is my husband, but I've got no idea who this woman is. Paul's wearing a black tie suit, and this blonde woman is wearing what looks like a ball gown. I had no idea when the photo was taken, who this woman was, what Paul was doing there, or what the event was. I felt sick. I felt like my whole life was spinning out of control.
Brooklyn Carter is mortified to discover pictures of her husband in the very close company of another woman.
I'm realizing that this is not an old photo from some time before my time with Paul. This is something that's going on now that shouldn't be going on.
It doesn't take long to figure out that the event is an engagement party, and the lady in red is Paul's new fiancée.
Catherine Dubois was a Melbourne woman. She was a bit of a socialite, had great friends, but love was missing, and so she went online to find that. Catherine met Paul on Tinder. Paul rocked up to that date driving a Maserati and claimed he owned a big fleet of them. He claimed to be a self-made millionaire with this big property empire across Melbourne and Queensland.
The courtship begins after Brooklyn leaves for Boston.
Catherine said it was something of a whirlwind romance. He was extremely kind, he paid a lot of attention to her, and came across as extremely committed. She decided to move in with him, and to her shock, he lived in this basic townhouse in Box Hill, which is certainly not where you'd think a multimillionaire lives. Paul had an explanation, and that was that this was a temporary place that he was living while he and his ex-partner had been building this dream home. He actually told her his ex-wife had passed away with brain cancer, so she stopped asking questions. It was about 12 weeks into their love story. Paul got down on one knee and asked Catherine to marry him, and it was an easy yes for her. Catherine owned a beauty bar just outside of Melbourne, and it was to be acquired by the government to make way for a major road project. Catherine said that Paul really convinced her that he was something of an acquisitions expert, and so she was quick to transfer him power of attorney.
With Brooklyn conveniently tucked away in Boston, Paul Carter feels confident that he's safe to openly celebrate his new love. But he fails to consider the massive reach of social media.
After several months of me questioning whether he was having an affair or he was becoming more and more distant, I finally had the proof. So I called him and I said to him, "What the hell is this? What is going on?" He said that he would come over to Boston, and in the meantime we were doing counselling over the phone and trying to figure out if this was at all salvageable.
In Australia, Catherine Dubois receives a very similar shock.
After Catherine and Paul's engagement party, she receives a call from somebody who knows Paul, and they tell her, "He has a wife and child in the US. You need to end this." Catherine now believes that he was trying to take over the beauty salon that she'd transferred into his name.
Paul and Catherine break off their relationship, and in November 2014, Paul heads off to Boston and attempts to patch up his relationship with Brooklyn.
He was able to convince me that he was remorseful for what he had done. I'd already been through a divorce and lost my kids. I wasn't going to risk doing that again and losing my youngest son. So I was going to do whatever I had to do to make it work. I still felt like I could pull out the defibrillator once again and restart the heart and try and get things back on track.
On a romantic trip to New York City for Brooklyn's 46th birthday, Paul tells her he wants to renew his commitment to her.
We had a lovely weekend in New York City, and he had organized with a jeweler to look at some diamonds because he was going to get a ring made for me.
But within weeks, it becomes clear she'll never get that diamond ring.
The money hasn't been transferred to the jeweler. No money has come into our accounts. I had faced about as much humiliation as I could take at this point. I was really losing faith in Paul. But I want to be able to say to my kids that I gave it my best shot. I didn't just quit because it got too hard. I just wasn't prepared to lose all that money and then find out a couple of weeks later that he inherited tens of millions of dollars from his grandmother.
Paul has one more gambit to keep Brooklyn happy.
Early 2018, we took over a lease on a horse farm that we were to purchase. We had scheduled the closing to coincide with plenty of time for the money to come from overseas.
Paul spent many years convincing Brooklyn that he was to inherit, and every time this deal was due to close, there was always an excuse as to why it wasn't happening. He would go to extreme lengths to keep up the con. Fake contracts written in Italian would be delivered to her door, and another time that she'd receive calls from a fake number, explained to her why this was being delayed.
With the final payment on the farm looming, Brooklyn puts pressure on Paul for some financial relief. And this turns into his breaking point.
Paul came home and said, there's no inheritance. There isn't any money coming, there's no money. I slid down the fridge and onto the floor like a cartoon character. The whole game was up.
Furious and deeply betrayed, Brooklyn kicks Paul out.
I was now left with this farm that I had to pay for. I enlisted the support of my dad to help figure out the financial part of it until I was able to sell my house and repay him. Fortunately for me, my father made me sign a prenup with Paul, so I didn't end up having to split our assets. Finally, I had control of my life back again from Paul Carter. Or so I thought.
Paul, cut off from his slush fund, is angry and desperate.
Paul shows up to the farm. He was really angry. And he says to me, I'm going to kill myself, but I'm going to make sure I take you down with me. And I just felt chills go down my spine.
Brooklyn Carter is finally coming clean with herself about who her husband really is. And she's terrified.
He was not in control of money, property, our child, nothing. The gravy train had well and truly stopped, and it just enraged him. I went out and bought myself a rifle. My son was sleeping with a baseball bat next to his bed. I was terrified of what might happen.
Brooklyn gets a restraining order, and then finally, after 16 years of marriage, she files for divorce.
I couldn't lose any more money, I couldn't lose any more sleep, I couldn't be any more miserable. I thought, if I don't do something now, I'm not even going to have the energy to get out of this marriage.
In August 2019, the divorce becomes final, and Brooklyn gets full custody of Mac.
I couldn't hold back my emotion, and I burst into tears, and my head fell onto the desk in the courtroom.
But there is just one problem.
I became increasingly concerned about being on the same visa as Paul Carter. I decided I needed to get Mac and I a new visa. My very close friend suggested that we get married because we both had no intentions of ever remarrying in our lives.
Brooklyn and her female friend hold a garden wedding in Albany in September 2019.
She was going to come and live at the house that I had built at my farm, and we were just going to grow old together and help each other out and be companions for each other.
Before the couple can even move in together, Brooklyn's life takes an unforeseen turn.
I get a call from 60 Minutes Australia.
He may look like an ordinary bloke, but this is one of Australia's most cunning con men, a ruthless operator who's fleeced millions from family, friends, the rich and the poor.
60 Minutes seemed to have even more information about things that he had done that I had no clue about.
We gave him the moniker the Casanova con man because his biggest cons were of women he made believe that he loved them.
Paul Carter.
They tracked him down at a job site, which was a very rewarding moment to see because they made him come down off the roof and it was just perfect.
Why would you tell Catherine that your partner had died of bone
Yeah, that was a
cancer?
mistake. I was going through a bad time with my then wife, and it was just a mistake.
They knew about the Uniting Church fiasco, and they just had facts and figures and numbers on different projects that he was doing. He hadn't had time to prepare any answers, but he still denied everything.
So I keep hearing this, but I don't know who you're talking about.
He's just deny, 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 deny.
What about the Italian inheritance that didn't exist?
There isn't one.
Was that not a mistake?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
After the expose, Paul Carter becomes the subject of a Homeland Security investigation.
He had engaged in these fraud schemes for many years with almost no law enforcement intervention. We were able to determine that he had used multiple identities. At that time, his most recent name is Paul Hamilton. We execute a search warrant at his residence. We found a law diploma under the name of Paul Hamilton. We found a document that was fraudulent from the Department of Homeland Security indicating that he had been awarded United States citizenship. We found military uniforms in his closet. We found a document indicating that he was the beneficiary of over $30 million in trust funds. All of these items were in line with what the underlying allegations were about him. We immediately arrested Paul Carter. So we took him into custody on the felony charges of visa fraud and false statements.
This should have been the end of Brooklyn's nightmare with Paul, except that her marriage to him has put her under the microscope of Homeland Security as well.
A couple of months later, it was about 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and there's a knock on the door. Brooklyn, we need you to open the door. It's Homeland Security.
The execution of the search warrant at Brooklyn's house was specifically in regard to the allegations of marriage fraud against her.
They're bashing on the door. Open the door, Brooklyn. So I opened the door, and 8 agents in bulletproof vests with guns stormed through my door and up the stairs. They took all our cell phones and computers, took my son's gaming computer, everything that they could get their hands on, and sent it to Quantico to get analysed.
Brooklyn is suspected of committing marriage fraud with her wife in order to gain a green card.
I was not prepared to drag her or her family through the mud with the government. This was supposed to be a happy situation for both of us.
Brooklyn divorces her wife in June 2020.
They never charged me with marriage fraud, but it was enough for them to then look at the ESTA form that I'd filled in and decide, oh, well, that's not right either. There was a felony charge for filling in the ESTA while I was still in the United States.
Brooklyn Carter ultimately pled guilty to making false statements on the ESTA application, which is utilized to re-enter the United States at some point.
Paul Carter also faces his day of reckoning in a federal court, and despite the many allegations, he too is charged with visa fraud on April 7th, 2021, and held in an Albany jail.
Paul Carter was sentenced to time served and a $5,000 fine. We were not, as an agency, pleased with the sentence, but he's now a convicted felon, which in part is based on the work that our agency and our office did.
His deportation hearing has been delayed, and now he has moved to the other side of the country and applied for a green card. So it seems that he's bought himself another couple of years of stalling techniques.
I think based on his history, it's likely that he'll come back around. I'd be surprised if we haven't heard the last of Paul Carter.
Meanwhile, because of Brooklyn's conviction, she must leave the United States. A huge disappointment, but there is a silver lining. A man named Sean Donahue.
I heard that she had to leave the country, and I said, I'm gonna marry you, and I'm gonna get your son away from Paul. And if he'll have me and you'll allow it, I'm going to adopt him and make him a Donahue.
I can't overstate how wonderful he has been to Mac and I. He's the happy ending that we deserve. I've brought chaos to this man's life, and he's still there standing right beside me. And I believe he will be till our dying days.
We're happy as can be now. We are not going to let anybody shatter our marriage. And I'll be with Brooklyn as soon as I can in another country at the soonest available time.
I've been dragged through the gates of hell to get to the happy ending. I've come out the other end. It's going to make a good story for my grandchildren, that's for sure.
It begins with silence, the kind that presses against the ears, heavy and unnatural, hanging over a city that never truly sleeps. Berlin, winter of 1987. The wall still stands. The streets are cold, divided, watched. And somewhere between flickering streetlights and concrete shadows, a life disappears without a sound. No scream, no witnesses, just absence. By morning, it will already be called a mystery. By nightfall, a nightmare. And decades later, it will be whispered with two words that refuse to die: cold case. The apartment is small, third floor. A narrow staircase that smells of damp coats and cigarette smoke. Inside, nothing appears broken. No forced entry. A cup sits half full on the table, the surface of the coffee long gone cold. A thin film floating like time itself has stopped mid-breath. A chair is pulled back, as if someone stood up quickly or never sat down at all. The radio is still on. Static. Low. Humming. A detail that will later haunt the detectives who step inside and realize that whatever happened here did not announce itself loudly. It slipped in quietly, and then it vanished. Neighbors will say they heard nothing, or maybe they heard something and dismissed it. A door closing, footsteps in the hall, the ordinary noise of a city trained to ignore itself. In 1987 Berlin, silence is survival. Questions are dangerous. Curiosity has consequences. And so when the name is finally reported missing, hours have already been lost. Precious hours. The kind that never come back. Police arrive with notebooks and tired eyes. They photograph the room. They dust surfaces. They collect what little there is to collect. A fingerprint smudged beyond recognition. A shoe print that could belong to anyone. No blood. No weapon. No clear direction. Just a life interrupted and a city that refuses to explain itself. The file is opened. A number is stamped on the cover. Another investigation begins its slow march toward uncertainty. The victim is ordinary, and that is part of the problem. No criminal record. No known enemies. No dramatic backstory that points neatly toward a suspect. Friends describe routines, habits, favorite cafes, predictable routes home. A life lived in repetition, which makes the rupture all the more disturbing. Because when someone like this disappears, it suggests something far more unsettling. Randomness. And randomness terrifies communities far more than monsters they can name. Detectives knock on doors. They ask about unfamiliar faces, strange cars, arguments overheard through thin walls. Answers come back fragmented, inconsistent, unreliable. Memory fades quickly under pressure. People contradict themselves. Fear edits the truth. And all the while, the clock keeps moving forward, indifferent to human urgency. Days pass, then weeks. The newspapers move on. Other crimes demand attention. Other victims demand justice. This one begins to sink beneath the surface. The case file grows heavier, thicker with paper but lighter with hope. Leads dead end. Tips evaporate. A man vaguely resembling a sketch is questioned, released, forgotten. Another name surfaces, then disappears into bureaucratic fog. The city changes. The wall falls. Berlin reinvents itself. But this file stays exactly where it is, boxed, labeled, shelved, cold. Years later, younger detectives will pull it down and feel the weight of failure in their hands. They will read the notes of men who have retired, some who have died. They will trace circles drawn decades earlier, wondering what was missed, what was ignored, what was never even seen. They will ask the same questions, stand in the same rooms, stare at the same photographs. And still, no answers emerge. Families age. Grief calcifies into something quieter but heavier. Hope becomes conditional. Every phone call carries the possibility of revelation or disappointment. Birthdays pass. Anniversaries of disappearance are marked not with ceremonies, but with silence. A chair that remains empty. A name that lingers in conversation like a ghost no one wants to acknowledge directly. And then, without warning, something stirs. Not a confession. Not a witness coming forward in tears. Something colder. More clinical. A re-examination. A technological shift. Evidence once considered useless is looked at again. Through new eyes, new machines, new possibilities. A sample too small to matter in 1987 suddenly matters a great deal. A trace becomes a thread, and the thread begins to pull. Inside police headquarters, a screen lights up. A match probability climbs higher, then higher still. Numbers that were impossible decades ago now refuse to be ignored. A name surfaces, unfamiliar, unremarkable, hidden in plain sight. Not a fugitive, not a recluse. Someone who lived a life, raised a family, paid bills, blended in seamlessly with a society that had long since buried the past. The realization lands quietly at first. Then it detonates. Detectives stare at each other. 36 years. 36 winters. 36 summers where the answer existed somewhere. Breathing, walking, aging. The cold case is no longer cold. It is burning. Orders are signed. A knock is planned. And somewhere in Berlin, a door is about to open. Not onto freedom, but onto a history that has been waiting patiently for its moment to return. The city holds its breath again. The knock comes early, deliberate, measured, the kind that carries authority without raising its voice. And on the other side of the door a man pauses, hand hovering, a fraction of a second where instinct senses something is wrong before the mind can explain it, before memory has time to run, before the past has a chance to hide again. When the door opens, the hallway light spills in, flat and unforgiving, illuminating faces that do not belong to his routine, badges that do not smile, eyes that already know his name, his date of birth, the shape of a night he thought had been erased by time. He does not ask why they are here. He already knows. Somewhere deep inside, the cold case has never truly slept. Inside police vehicles, radios murmur, engines idle, the city waking around a moment that has been decades in the making. The arrest is quiet, almost polite. No handcuffs clanking for the cameras, no dramatic resistance. Just a man guided downstairs he has walked thousands of times, now suddenly aware of every step, every echo, every neighbor's door that remains closed. The past is finally catching up, and it does not need to shout. At headquarters, fluorescent lights hum above a room designed to strip away illusions. The walls are bare. The table is metal. A recorder clicks on with a sound so small it feels insulting compared to the weight of what it represents. Detectives sit across from him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the restraint of people who have learned that time changes nothing about guilt, only the way it hides. They slide photographs across the table, black and white images from another era. A room frozen in disorder, a coffee cup, a chair, a radio forever humming static. He studies them carefully, too carefully. His face remains controlled, disciplined, but his breathing changes, subtle, almost imperceptible, the body betraying what the mouth refuses to acknowledge. He says little. Denials come out rehearsed, generic, words chosen not for truth but for distance. 36 years have taught him how to speak without saying anything at all. The detectives push gently, relentlessly, circling the night of 1987, asking him to remember where he was, who he saw, what he did. He offers fragments, half-memories, excuses softened by age. Time has eroded his alibis, blurred their edges, but he hopes it has done the same to the evidence. He hopes wrong. In another room, technicians re-examine files that smell faintly of dust and ink. Old handwriting meets modern databases. A single biological trace, once catalogued and forgotten, now sits at the center of everything. In 1987, it was nothing more than a curiosity, an anomaly too small to pursue. Today, it speaks with mathematical certainty. It does not forget. It does not forgive. It does not care how many years have passed. The numbers are devastating. Probability collapses into inevitability. There is no alternative explanation left standing. The suspect's past, once ordinary, begins to unravel under scrutiny. Old addresses connect. Timelines align. A route walked long ago reappears, suddenly vivid. A witness statement dismissed as unreliable now reads differently, sharpened by context. The case, once a maze, starts to resemble a straight line that no one wanted to see. Outside the interrogation rooms, news leaks. A reporter hears a rumor. Then another confirms it. Phones light up across the city. Berlin holds a collective pause as headlines form, as a phrase long associated with failure is rewritten into something else. Cold case reopened. Suspect arrested. 36 years. The words hit with the force of revelation and accusation at the same time. For the victim's family, the call comes without warning. A voice on the other end introduces itself carefully, respectfully, knowing that every word carries risk. They have lived with uncertainty for so long that clarity feels almost dangerous. When the truth is finally spoken, it does not arrive as relief. It arrives as shock, as disbelief, as a reopening of wounds that never truly healed, only hardened. They remember the early days, the posters, the interviews, the promises made by men who believed the case would be solved quickly. They remember how those promises faded, replaced by silence and polite updates that said nothing. Now suddenly the silence has broken, and with it comes a flood of emotions that do not fit neatly into any one shape. Anger, sadness, a fragile, trembling sense of justice delayed but not denied. The suspect remains composed as the hours stretch on. He asks for water. He asks for a break. He avoids the photographs now. The detectives watch him carefully, knowing that cracks do not appear on command. They appear when pressure meets memory in unexpected ways. They mention names, streets, weather, a detail so specific it cannot be coincidence. His jaw tightens. His gaze drops. For a moment, the mask slips. It is not a confession. Not yet. It is something more revealing. Recognition. Outside, the city reacts unevenly. Some are stunned that such a crime could linger unresolved for so long. Others are unsettled by the idea that someone capable of such an act lived among them unnoticed, unremarkable, invisible. The case becomes a mirror, reflecting fears that have always existed beneath the surface. That justice is fragile, that time protects the wrong people, that evil does not always announce itself. Inside court documents, language remains clinical, restrained. Dates, charges, evidence summaries. But beneath the legal structure lies a human story that refuses to be contained. The suspect's life is dissected, every decade scrutinized, every decision reinterpreted through the lens of what he is now accused of. Friends are questioned. Former colleagues struggle to reconcile the man they knew with the accusations splashed across screens. The interrogation continues, looping back, tightening. Detectives remind him that the science does not lie, that the numbers cannot be argued with, that time has not erased the truth, only delayed it. He listens, silent, the weight of inevitability pressing down. Somewhere deep inside, the cold case finally reaches its conclusion. Not in public, not with drama, but in the quiet collapse of denial. And yet, even as the world declares the mystery solved, something lingers. Because answers do not undo damage. Arrests do not restore lost years. The city may move forward, headlines may fade, but the echo of that night in 1987 remains, embedded in walls, memories, and unanswered questions that no verdict can fully erase. The cold case has been reopened, but its shadow is far from gone. The night of 1987 refuses to stay buried, rising now in fragments as the interrogation grinds forward. Every question pulling at threads the suspect once believed had rotted away with time. Every pause stretching longer than the last, heavy with what remains unsaid. Detectives lean back, letting silence do the work, knowing that after 36 years the most dangerous thing they can offer him is space to remember. Memory is not loyal. It slips, contradicts itself, and eventually it turns. They return again to the hours before the disappearance. reconstructing the city as it was then, street by street, minute by minute, a Berlin divided not just by concrete but by fear and secrecy. They talk about the weather, the way cold clung to skin that winter, the way breath fogged the air under orange street lamps. They mention a bar 2 blocks away, a place long gone, replaced now by glass and steel, but once alive with smoke and murmurs. His eyes flicker, just once. Enough. In another building, analysts pore over maps yellowed by age, aligning old patrol routes with modern satellite overlays. What once seemed chaotic now reveals patterns. A shortcut here, a blind corner there, a stretch of road poorly lit, rarely patrolled. In 1987, it was invisible. Now it stands out like a confession written into asphalt. The realization is slow, devastating. This was not random. It never was. Witness statements are reread with fresh attention. A neighbor who thought they heard a radio playing late into the night. A passerby who noticed a figure lingering too long near the stairwell. At the time, these details drowned in noise, buried beneath Cold War paranoia and daily survival. Today, they click into place with disturbing clarity. The past has not changed. Only the willingness to see it has. The suspect's timeline begins to fracture under pressure. Small inconsistencies widen into gaps. He corrects himself too often. He remembers details he should not, forgets ones that should be etched into him. Detectives note every shift, every hesitation, every defensive gesture. They are not chasing a confession. They are documenting collapse. Outside, the story grows louder. Media vans cluster near police headquarters. Cameras point at doors that refuse to open. Commentators speculate, experts debate, armchair detectives resurrect theories long dismissed. The phrase cold case is repeated so often it starts to lose its neutrality, transforming into an accusation aimed not just at the suspect, but at the years that allowed him to live untouched. For the family, the waiting is unbearable. Answers are coming, but not fast enough, not clean enough. Each new detail feels like a betrayal of the hope they once had, the hope that if the truth ever came, it would bring peace. Instead, it brings questions they never thought to ask. Why now? Why him? Why did no one see this sooner? Inside the interrogation room, detectives introduce something new. Not evidence, not numbers, emotion. They speak of the victim not as a case, not as a file, but as a person, a routine, a life interrupted, a family that never moved on. The suspect stiffens. His defenses are built for logic, not humanity. This is unfamiliar terrain. Minutes stretch into hours. The air grows stale. The recorder keeps running. He rubs his hands together, a nervous habit that surfaces again and again. He asks what will happen next. The question hangs there, revealing more than he intends. They tell him the process. Charges, court, public reckoning. A past dragged fully into the light. The city reacts in waves. Some celebrate the power of modern science, the idea that no crime truly escapes time. Others feel a quieter dread, the realization that justice is not inevitable, that it requires persistence, luck, and technology that did not exist when it mattered most. The cold case becomes a symbol, not just of resolution, but of everything that nearly went unresolved. Investigators revisit the original scene, now transformed beyond recognition. The building stands, renovated, repainted, modernized. New residents move through hallways unaware of what once unfolded there. Detectives walk the same stairs, imagining the sounds, the timing, the choices made in seconds that echoed for decades. The past overlays the present, impossible to separate. In a secure room, evidence bags are reopened one by one, objects handled carefully, almost reverently, as if aware of the years they have waited. Each item tells a partial story. None of them alone are enough. Together, they form something undeniable, a narrative of opportunity, control, and silence. The suspect is informed formally. The charges are read. The language is precise, unemotional, devastating in its clarity. He listens without interruption. When it is over, he nods slowly, as if acknowledging a truth he has long rehearsed for. even if he never expected to face it. His voice, when he speaks again, is barely above a whisper. He asks for time. The detectives exchange glances. Time is the one thing this case has already consumed. Still, they allow a pause. The recorder keeps running. Silence returns, thick and oppressive, filling the room like fog. In that silence, 36 years press down at once, memories colliding with consequences, denial struggling against inevitability. Outside, Berlin moves on, trams rattling past cafes, conversations unfolding unaware that history is shifting quietly behind closed doors. But for those bound to this case, movement has stopped. Everything narrows to this moment, this room, this man, and a truth that has waited nearly 4 decades to be heard. The cold case is no longer dormant. It is awake, restless, demanding its final reckoning. The pause does not bring relief. It sharpens everything. In the silence, the suspect's breathing grows uneven, the rhythm betraying the strain of holding a story together that was never meant to last this long. They return to specifics with surgical precision. The stairwell light that flickered that winter. The angle of the door when it was last seen ajar. The radio frequency that hummed through the apartment. A station that signed off just after midnight. Details that seem trivial until they are not. Details that only someone present would know. His eyes close briefly, a reflexive attempt to shut out a past that is now fully awake. Across town, prosecutors review transcripts, highlighting passages that signal pressure points. They prepare not for drama, but for endurance. This case will not hinge on a single confession or a cinematic revelation. It will be built piece by piece, layer by layer, a structure strong enough to withstand decades of doubt. Every word spoken in that room is weighed, catalogued, preserved. The suspect's requests become smaller, more human. Another glass of water, a moment to stand. His posture changes when he moves, the stiffness of someone unused to being watched this closely. He avoids the mirror on the wall. He avoids the photographs. He avoids the past as if it might physically reach out and touch him. It already has. Detectives shift tactics subtly. They stop pushing. They start listening. Silence again, but this time different. Inviting. Dangerous. And then, without warning, a sentence escapes him that does not belong to his prepared denials. A reference to timing, to distance, to something that was never disclosed publicly. The room stills. The recorder captures everything. They do not react. They cannot afford to. They mark the moment internally, knowing it will echo later in courtrooms and headlines. The past has cracked open just enough to reveal its edges. Enough. Outside the station, public reaction grows more complex. Initial shock gives way to debate. Commentators argue about justice delayed, about institutional failure, about whether closure after 36 years can still be called closure at all. Others focus on the suspect, dissecting old photographs, speculating on how someone could live a seemingly normal life while carrying such a secret. The cold case becomes a mirror for collective anxiety. For the family, the waiting room feels timeless. Chairs uncomfortable, coffee untouched. Each update brings more clarity and more pain. They are asked to recall memories long buried, to identify belongings, to confirm details that reopen wounds they thought had scarred over. Grief, they discover, does not diminish with time. It changes shape. It learns patience. Investigators revisit overlooked connections, relationships once deemed insignificant. A brief acquaintance, a shared space, a coincidence dismissed as harmless. With the suspect's name now attached, these fragments gain new meaning. The investigation expands backward, reconstructing a network of choices that converged on one night and then dispersed into decades of silence. The suspect is informed that the pause is over. Questions resume, sharper now, more direct. He answers selectively, carefully, choosing words as if navigating a minefield he once mapped himself. But memory betrays him again. Small contradictions surface. Times shift. Distances shrink. The story no longer holds its shape. In a secured evidence room, forensic specialists finalize reports that translate human acts into irrefutable data. The language is sterile, almost cruel in its objectivity. There is no room for interpretation, no appeal to character or age. Numbers speak. They always have. The city absorbs the unfolding truth unevenly. For some, it is validation that no crime is ever truly forgotten. For others, it is a reminder that forgetting is often a choice, made collectively, until technology or persistence forces remembrance. Berlin, rebuilt and rebranded countless times since 1987, confronts a version of itself it would rather leave behind. Late into the night, the suspect sits alone, the interrogation room empty now, the recorder finally silent. He stares at the table, tracing scratches with his finger, marks left by countless others who have sat where he sits now, each convinced their story was different. His is not. When detectives return, the air feels heavier. Not with anticipation, but with inevitability. They lay out the path forward. Charges, proceedings, a public reckoning that will not be gentle. He listens without interruption. There is no outburst, no collapse, just a quiet acknowledgement that the future he imagined has narrowed dramatically. Somewhere beyond the walls of the station, life continues, indifferent and relentless. But for those bound to this case, movement has slowed to a crawl. The cold case, once a symbol of failure, now stands as proof of something else entirely. That time can hide the truth, but it cannot erase it. And as the night deepens, the shadow of 1987 stretches long across the present, refusing, at last, to be ignored. Dawn creeps in slowly, pale and indifferent, slipping through narrow windows as if unaware of the weight the night has carried. Inside the station, fatigue settles into bones, but no one leaves. Not yet. This is the hour when cases either fracture or harden, when exhaustion strips away performance and leaves only what is real. The suspect has not slept. Neither have the detectives. Time, once again, presses inward from all sides. They bring him back in without ceremony. No accusations now. No raised voices. Just the steady presence of people who know they no longer need permission from the past. The questions resume, anchored in precision. Dates, routes, small habits, the kind of details memory cannot fabricate without tripping over itself. He answers more slowly now. Each sentence feels heavier, as though spoken underwater. Outside, official statements begin to circulate, carefully worded, restrained, acknowledging progress without declaring victory. The phrase cold case appears again, but now paired with something else: accountability. The city reads between the lines. This is no longer speculation. This is history being corrected in real time. The family is informed that charges are imminent. The words land unevenly, like stones dropped into still water. Relief does not come. Instead, a deeper quiet settles in, heavier than grief, heavier than hope. For years, uncertainty allowed imagination to soften reality. Now reality sharpens everything. Faces once blurred by time become vivid again. Voices return. Dreams resume where they left off unfinished. Investigators confront the suspect with timelines reconstructed to the minute. Where he claims to have been versus where evidence places him. Where opportunity met absence. Where chance became choice. He listens, nodding occasionally, as if following a lecture rather than an indictment of his life. But the cracks are widening. His voice falters. He repeats himself. The past no longer aligns with the story he rehearsed for decades. A single question changes the temperature of the room. Not about the act itself, but about what came after. How he lived. How he slept. How he watched the city move on while knowing it carried a wound he helped create. The question hangs unanswered. His silence is louder than anything he has said so far. In preparation for court, prosecutors assemble a narrative that spans generations. They understand this is not just about one crime, but about time itself. About what happens when justice pauses and then resumes. Every document, every transcript, every piece of evidence must withstand scrutiny not just from a jury, but from history. Public reaction shifts again. Shock evolves into introspection. Conversations turn toward institutional memory, toward cases lost not to malice but to limitation. Technology becomes both hero and indictment, a reminder of how many answers once lay just beyond reach. The cold case becomes a lesson, uncomfortable but necessary. The suspect is offered the chance to speak freely. No promises, no threats, just the truth if he chooses it. He clears his throat. His hands tremble now, no longer concealed. When he speaks, it is not a confession, but it is no longer denial either. It is something in between, a surrender of control, a quiet admission that the past has finally outrun him. Details emerge slowly, cautiously, like fragments breaking through ice. Not enough to absolve, not enough to explain, just enough to confirm what evidence already knows. The detectives listen without interruption. This is not the climax they imagined years ago. It is messier, more human, more devastating. As night falls again, paperwork replaces questioning. Orders are signed. Procedures followed. The machinery of justice moves forward, deliberate and unromantic. The suspect is transferred, the door closing behind him with a finality that resonates through the corridor. It is not the sound of an ending. It is the sound of consequence. The family leaves the station in silence, stepping into a city that feels unfamiliar despite decades of familiarity. Nothing looks different, yet everything has changed. The absence that defined their lives has shifted shape. It no longer floats unanswered. It has weight, and weight brings exhaustion. The cold case, once frozen in uncertainty, now moves forward under its own gravity. But resolution does not erase impact. It does not rewind time. It does not restore what was taken. It simply insists that the truth, however delayed, must be acknowledged. And in the quiet after the storm of revelation, one thing becomes painfully clear. Some nights never end. They just wait. Morning breaks again, but this time it feels different, heavier, as if the city itself senses that something irreversible has shifted beneath its streets. Berlin moves, breathes, commutes, but under the ordinary rhythms there is a low vibration of awareness, a collective murmur that the past has finally broken through the surface. Inside holding cells and offices, inside courtrooms being prepared and files being carried from room to room, the cold case has crossed a threshold from memory into consequence. The suspect wakes to unfamiliar sounds, metal doors, distant footsteps, voices stripped of all pretense. There is no more ambiguity now, no space left for stories that float without anchor. His name is printed on documents that do not age, that will follow him forward the way the crime followed him through time. He reads them slowly, line by line, absorbing language that translates a single night into charges, statutes, permanence. The words are unemotional. They do not accuse. They simply state. Investigators review everything once more, not because they doubt it, but because doubt has defined this case for too long. They replay recordings, reread transcripts, scrutinize the moment when the suspect's voice changed, when memory slipped, when the past leaked through. These are not dramatic revelations. They are small fractures, the kind that only appear when pressure is sustained long enough. This is how cold cases truly end. Not with fireworks, but with erosion. The courtroom is prepared quietly. No cameras allowed inside yet, but the air is already thick with anticipation. Legal teams move with disciplined urgency, aware that this case will be watched not only for its outcome, but for what it represents. A crime older than many of those now involved. A failure revisited. A test of whether justice can still claim relevance after so much time has passed. For the family, the days blur together. Interviews, statements, confirmations. They are asked to revisit details they once begged to forget. What was worn? What was said? What was planned for the future that never arrived? Each question pulls at a thread connecting past and present, tightening something in their chests they cannot name. They are careful with their words now, knowing that everything they say will be recorded, dissected, preserved. Public discourse grows sharper. Some demand answers that no trial can provide. Others warn against celebrating an arrest as redemption. Commentators argue over responsibility, over whether justice delayed becomes a different kind of injustice. The cold case transforms into a national conversation, uncomfortable and unresolved, forcing people to confront how many other stories remain buried, waiting for the same convergence of persistence and chance. The suspect's behavior shifts subtly. The controlled composure of earlier hours erodes into something quieter, more inward. He asks fewer questions. He listens more. In moments of solitude, memories surface uninvited, fragments of sound and movement that no amount of time has fully erased. He does not share them. He does not need to. His silence now carries its own testimony. Investigators begin preparing for testimony, rehearsing how to explain decades of stagnation without defensiveness, how to describe missed opportunities without rewriting history. They know they will be asked why it took so long. They know there is no single answer. Technology, resources, human error, fear, all of it. None of it enough on its own. Together, an explanation that feels insufficient even as it is true. Late one evening, a detective returns alone to the original street. The building stands unchanged in outline, altered in detail. New windows, fresh paint, different names on mailboxes. He stands there longer than necessary, listening to the city, imagining the night as it was, trying to understand how something so final could have happened so quietly. The answer does not come. It never does. Inside detention, the suspect receives notice of the next steps. Dates, procedures, the future reduced to a sequence of formalities. He nods, signs where instructed. The ritual of accountability proceeds, indifferent to emotion. When he is alone again, he stares at the wall, tracing patterns in concrete that resemble nothing and everything at once. Time, once stretched endlessly before him, now feels compressed, dense, unyielding. The cold case has reached a point of no return. Yet resolution remains incomplete. Questions linger that no verdict will settle. Why this night? Why this person? Why silence? The answers, if they exist, remain locked inside a moment that cannot be revisited, only reconstructed. As Berlin settles into another night, lights flicker on across the city, windows glowing like scattered constellations. Life continues, relentless and ordinary. But beneath it all, the echo of 1987 persists, no longer ignored, no longer dormant, demanding to be carried forward until the final word is spoken. And even then, the weight will remain. The first hearing arrives like a low rumble before a storm, not loud enough to shake the city, but deep enough to make everyone who has carried this story feel it in their ribs. Berlin doesn't stop for court dates. Trains still run, coffee still pours, people still argue over small things. But in the spaces between routine, the name of the case slips into conversations like a chill draft through an old window. 36 years is a lifetime, and yet the moment the suspect is led into the building, it feels as if 1987 is standing in the doorway with him, refusing to wait outside. He walks slower than he did on the day of the arrest, not because he is weak, but because he is calculating. Cameras are there now, microphones, lenses hungry for anything that looks like guilt. His face remains controlled, but it has changed. The confidence of anonymity is gone, replaced by a tight, defensive stillness. He does not look at the crowd. He does not look for sympathy. He looks forward, as if the future is a narrow corridor and the only way through is to pretend he can't hear the past screaming behind him. Inside, the air is antiseptic. Paper, polished wood, quiet authority. The language spoken here is not the language of grief or shock. It is the language of procedure, and that makes it more frightening. Because procedure does not care about time. It does not care that witnesses are older, memories thinner, hearts exhausted. It moves forward anyway, and it will keep moving until it reaches a conclusion, whether anyone is ready or not. The prosecutor's voice is measured, calm, almost gentle, which makes every word cut deeper. The timeline is laid out like a map pinned flat on a table, every point connected by lines that didn't exist in 1987. A trace, a match, a chain of custody that survived years of neglect, staff changes, reforms, relocations. A miracle of bureaucracy, some call it. Others call it luck. The prosecutor calls it evidence. And in that room, evidence is the only religion. The defense speaks next, and the temperature shifts. They don't deny the case exists. They deny its certainty. They raise the specter of contamination, of degraded samples, of mistakes made by humans who were not even involved back then. They talk about reasonable doubt, as if doubt is a right that grows stronger with age. They imply what everyone fears, that the longer a case stays unsolved, the more the truth becomes vulnerable, not to being disproved, but to being exhausted. The suspect sits motionless through it all. His hands rest on the table, fingers interlaced, a posture of restraint that could be discipline or performance. When he is asked to confirm his identity, his voice is quiet, steady, almost bored. The sound of it ripples through the room anyway, because it is the sound of a man answering questions about a night that belonged to another world. Outside, the family waits, not in a dramatic huddle, not sobbing for cameras, but in a silence so concentrated it feels like pressure. They have learned to protect themselves from spectacle. They have lived with this story long enough to know that public interest burns hot and fast, while grief burns slow and permanent. When they are told the hearing has ended and the next steps are scheduled, they nod as if receiving information about weather. And then, only when they are alone, the weight returns, thicker, darker, more real. The city's reaction fractures along invisible lines. Some people speak with certainty, their voices filled with righteous satisfaction. Finally, at last, justice. Others speak with suspicion. How can anyone be sure after all this time? And somewhere in the middle is the quiet majority, unsettled not by the suspect alone, but by what the case implies about ordinary life. That for decades, someone walked past them in supermarkets, stood near them at crosswalks, sat beside them on trains, carrying a secret that could have died with him if a single piece of evidence had been misplaced. Investigators keep working anyway. Court dates don't pause their urgency. They sharpen it. Now every detail matters not only to truth, but to persuasion. They reopen archival boxes, cardboard corners softened by time, files packed with old handwriting that looks like it belongs to a different species of policing. They find notes that were once dismissed as noise. A witness who mentioned a coat color, a peculiar smell in the stairwell, a car that idled too long. They scan these details into databases, cross-reference them against records that didn't exist back then, vehicle registrations, employment rosters, housing lists. The past becomes searchable. Then something else surfaces, and it doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives the way the most disturbing truths always do. Quietly, almost accidentally, in a stack of paperwork that someone nearly sets aside. A name appears more than once. Not as a suspect. No, nothing that direct, but as a background figure, a shadow on the edge of the victim's routine. Someone who shared a corridor, a workplace, a social space. Someone who had a reason to be near without raising alarm. The detectives pause. They stare at the page. They cross-check. The same name, the same address history, the same period. A thread that should have been pulled 36 years ago, now tightening in their hands like wire. They dig deeper, and the city's old layers peel open. Berlin in 1987 was a machine of partitions, official and unofficial, and in that environment people learned to exist in compartments. Secrets were currency. Silence was protection. And somewhere within those compartments, the suspect had space to move, space to do what he did, and then fold himself back into ordinary life like nothing had happened. A new witness is located, someone who was young then, someone who has aged into a voice the court will now listen to differently. They are hesitant at first, cautious, as if speaking might summon something. They have carried a memory like a splinter for decades, small enough to ignore, sharp enough to hurt whenever touched. They recall a face in a hallway, a glance that lingered too long, a moment that felt wrong but not wrong enough to call police in a city where calling police was never simple. They say they didn't think it mattered. They say they assumed someone else would handle it. They say they were afraid. The detectives don't judge them. Fear is part of the case. Fear is part of the city's history. They ask for details anyway, gently, because gentle is sometimes the only way to extract truth without breaking it. The witness speaks in bursts, stopping, starting, apologizing for gaps. But the gaps don't matter as much as the shape. The shape matches. Meanwhile, forensic teams prepare to explain the science like a story. They know jurors do not live in probabilities. They live in certainty and doubt, and the bridge between those worlds is clarity. Experts rehearse how to describe DNA not as magic, but as math. They prepare charts, simplified language, analogies that can survive cross-examination. They know the defense will attack not the numbers, but the trust. They know they must make the invisible feel undeniable. The suspect's attorneys file motions. They request exclusions. They demand documentation. They try to slow the momentum because momentum is dangerous in court. Momentum makes people believe, and belief, once established, is hard to dismantle. Every move is strategic, every word chosen to chip at confidence. But the case has something rare: time. Not as an enemy now, but as a witness. Time shows consistency. Time shows patterns. Time shows that the evidence, preserved through decades, did not conveniently appear. It waited. At night, detectives speak in hushed tones in offices lit by desk lamps, their faces tired, eyes red from reading. They replay the suspect's recorded statements, searching for the moment the mask slipped. They catch it again, an offhand reference to a timing detail that wasn't public, a correction too specific, a pause too long. They mark it. They build around it. They do not need him to confess. They need the story to stand without him. And yet, in a quiet moment, one detective wonders what kind of life someone builds on top of a buried crime. Not the sensational question of how could he, but the smaller, more unsettling question of how did he live with it day after day? Did he flinch when he saw old headlines? Did he feel anything when the wall fell, when the city changed, when people celebrated new beginnings? Or did he treat those events like scenery, just background to a private truth he believed time had sealed? The family, in their own quiet, wrestles with a different question. If the suspect is found guilty, what then? Not closure, not healing. Those words feel too clean. They imagine a verdict like a door closing, but doors don't erase what happened in the room behind them. A verdict would be a line drawn in ink across a page already stained with decades. It would matter. It would be necessary, but it would not restore. The community begins to map itself around the case. Some residents avoid the street where it started, as if geography can absorb trauma. Others visit it deliberately, standing there in daylight, trying to reconcile the ordinary with what they now know occurred there. Journalists interview neighbors, old classmates, former co-workers of both victim and suspect, pulling stories into the open, widening the circle of impact. The case becomes less about one night and more about how a city processes its own shadows. As the next court date approaches, pressure thickens again. The cold case is no longer just reopened. It is alive, moving, demanding attention. And beneath all the legal strategy, beneath the science and the headlines, one fact stands like a hard object in the throat. For 36 years, the truth was close enough to touch, and no one knew. Now everyone knows. And knowing is its own kind of shock because it means the past is not past at all. It is present. It is here. It is walking through the courthouse doors, and the city is watching, waiting for the moment when a story that refused to end is finally forced to stop running. The next court day doesn't arrive like a spectacle. It arrives like pressure. Slow, unavoidable, tightening the city's ribs until even ordinary noises feel sharp, and by the time the courthouse doors open, the crowd outside is already arranged into roles. Cameras hunting for angles, reporters balancing urgency with caution, citizens drawn by the strange gravity of a cold case that refuses to stay in the past. The suspect steps out again, older than the crime, but not older than consequence, and the flashes make him blink as if light itself is accusing him, as if the city is trying to burn a shadow off the pavement. Inside, the proceedings begin with the same controlled rhythm, the same formal language, but the atmosphere is different now, less about surprise, more about inevitability. The prosecutor stands and lays out the sequence the way a headline would, stripped of decoration. Berlin 1987, missing without explanation, cold case for decades, reopened, match, arrest. The words are clean, almost too clean, and the room feels the gap between the neatness of legal structure and the mess of human loss. The defense watches closely, waiting for any stumble, any inconsistency that could be turned into doubt, because doubt is their oxygen. Then the expert is called, not with fanfare, not with drama, but with the calm certainty of someone whose job is to translate invisible truths into something a courtroom can hold. The forensic testimony begins carefully, and every sentence is designed to survive attack. It's not presented as magic. It's presented as procedure, how the evidence was stored, how it was sealed, how it was logged, how it was retested, how it was compared, how probability becomes certainty without becoming arrogance. Charts appear, timelines, a sequence of custody forms that look boring until the room understands what they represent. Decades of a system not losing the one fragile thread that could still pull the whole truth into daylight. The defense crosses hard, not yelling, not performing for cameras, but using the sharpest tool available. The passage of time. They ask about old protocols, about degraded materials, about the possibility of error and contamination, about hands that touched evidence before modern safeguards existed. They speak the word maybe, as if repeating it enough times can change math. The expert answers in the same tone, returning again and again to documentation, to repeated tests, to standards, to controls, to the reality that modern results did not appear once, but multiple times, consistent, stubborn, unwilling to be persuaded by rhetoric. The room begins to feel it, a quiet shift from possibility to probability to something that looks like a straight line. Outside the courthouse, live feeds chop the story into pieces that fit screens, cold case evidence, DNA match, defense challenges reliability, family reacts. But inside, the narrative is not chopped. It is continuous, heavy, building. The family sits together without dramatics, hands folded, shoulders tense, eyes fixed forward as if looking away would invite collapse. They have waited too long to blink at the wrong moment. Each sentence spoken in court is a reopening, not of the case file, but of time itself. The investigators who carried the reopened phase are called next, and their testimony has a different texture, less sterile, more human, but still controlled. They describe how the file was retrieved, how old notes were reread, how overlooked tips were re-ranked, how the city's geography was remapped. They talk about what they found in the margins. Details once dismissed as too small, now anchored by the suspect's name. Corridor, a routine crossing, a location that made sense only when seen from the angle of someone who knew what to look for. They speak as if reporting weather, because in court, emotion is ammunition and they refuse to hand it over. Still, the impact lands because every methodical detail tells the same quiet truth. The answer was always closer than anyone wanted to believe. When the witness from the past takes the stand, the room tightens again. Not because the testimony is sensational, but because it is fragile. The witness is older now, voice changed by years, hands steady in a way that suggests a lifetime of carrying something heavy. They speak in short bursts, careful, apologetic, describing a moment that felt wrong back then but not wrong enough to stop the world. A glance in a hallway, presence that lingered, a feeling that something didn't fit. In 1987, feelings were not evidence, and fear made even feelings dangerous to share. The witness admits hesitation, admits silence, admits the long shadow of regret. The defense pushes, searching for cracks, questioning memory, questioning perception, questioning whether a decades-old impression can carry weight. The witness holds, not perfectly but honestly. The honesty matters. The suspect listens without expression, the way someone listens to a language they do not want to understand. At times, his face appears blank, and the blankness becomes its own kind of statement. When a photograph from the period appears on a screen, grainy and harsh, he does not look up. He keeps his gaze on the table as if the wood might offer refuge. The prosecution does not need him to react. Reaction is not evidence. But the absence of reaction changes the air anyway. A room can feel denial. A room can feel avoidance. A room can feel when someone is trying not to be seen. During a recess, the hallway becomes a current of whispers. Lawyers confer. Reporters type. Court staff move with practiced neutrality. In a corner, a detective speaks quietly to another, not celebrating, not relaxed, because cold cases don't end when arrests happen. They end when a narrative holds under scrutiny, when the story stands without wobble. This is the part that breaks cases. This is the part where mistakes are hunted. This is the part where every weakness is exploited. The detective's eyes are tired, but focused because time has already taken enough from this case. It will not take the outcome too. Back in session, the prosecutor introduces another layer, and it lands like a second headline stacked on the first. It's not about a new crime. It's about the life lived afterward, the proximity, the way the suspect's timeline overlaps with the victim's routines in ways that cannot be explained away as coincidence. It's the kind of overlap that looks harmless if you don't know what happened, and horrifying once you do. The court hears it described in neutral language, but the implication is loud. Opportunity existed. Access existed. Path existed. And after the night in question, the suspect had reason to disappear into normality, to become another face in a city full of faces. The defense counters by insisting that normality proves nothing, that ordinary life can be misread when viewed through the lens of accusation. They remind the court that a person can be near without being responsible, can be familiar without being guilty. They talk about the danger of narrative, the human instinct to connect dots until a picture appears. The prosecutor does not argue about instinct. They return to documentation, to patterns, to corroboration, to the stubbornness of physical evidence that does not care about storytelling. The battle becomes stark. Doubt versus structure, suggestion versus record. What if versus here is what we can prove? As the day drags on, the city outside grows restless. Public opinion shifts hourly, not because facts change, but because attention flickers and amplifies. Some people decide guilt is obvious, the cold case solved in their minds already. Others cling to skepticism, not because they trust the suspect, but because they fear the idea that the system might convict on a story built too late. The case becomes a proxy for larger fears. What time does to truth, what age does to certainty, what happens when justice arrives late and expects applause. The family leaves the courthouse at the end of the session with the same quiet they arrived with. There is no celebration. There is no relief. There is only endurance, and endurance looks like walking past cameras without looking up, like refusing to let strangers consume pain as content. Inside the car, the silence continues, not because they have nothing to say, but because language feels too small. Outside, headlines already rewrite the day into punchy lines. Cold case trial intensifies. Witness recalls chilling detail. Defense challenges DNA. The words travel fast. The truth moves slow. That night, the suspect sits in a cell that is too bright, too clean, too modern, as if the present is trying to deny the past even as it prosecutes it. He stares forward, eyes fixed on nothing, and the absence in his face becomes more unsettling than anger would be. Anger would be human. This is something else. Calculation, resignation, a private inventory of what he can still control and what has slipped beyond his reach. Somewhere in the building, paperwork is filed, signatures gathered, schedules set. The machinery continues, and Berlin, outside, keeps living. Lights in windows, footsteps on wet pavement, the faint rumble of trains. Yet the city feels subtly altered, as if an old stain has been found beneath new paint and no one can pretend it isn't there. The cold case is no longer a rumor, no longer a whisper, no longer a file forgotten in a box. It is on screens, in court records, in conversations, in the way people look at each other on public transit with the smallest increase in suspicion. In the quiet hours before dawn, the case does what it has always done. It presses itself into the mind, not as a story with a clean ending, but as a reminder that time does not erase, it only delays. The courtroom will open again. The questions will sharpen. The narrative will tighten. And the city will continue to watch, waiting for the moment when a truth that has run for 36 years finally runs out of road. The courthouse doors open again and the air inside feels tighter than before, as if every brick has absorbed the weight of the last session and is now exhaling it back into the room. And the audience is quieter, not calmer, just more aware that the story is narrowing, that the space for alternative explanations is shrinking with each witness, each document, each measured sentence that turns speculation into structure. The suspect is brought in with the same controlled routine. Steps, seating, a glance that never quite meets anyone else's eyes. And for a brief second the camera flashes outside feel distant, irrelevant. Because the real pressure is not in the hallway. It's here, in the room where time is being forced to account for itself. The prosecutor stands without flourish and calls the next witness. And the name lands like a small impact, not famous, not dramatic, but significant in the quiet way that always matters most in cases like this. Because the witness isn't here to tell a story, the witness is here to anchor one. A records custodian, an evidence technician, someone whose life has been spent cataloging, sealing, tracking, ensuring that fragile truth can survive the sloppy hands of years. The defense tries to inject doubt again, asks about old standards, about the chaos of archives, about the possibility that a mislabeled box could collapse everything, and the witness answers in a tone that does not care about courtroom drama because their loyalty is not to narrative but to practice. They describe redundancies, double logging, seal integrity, audits that happen years apart. Even the mistakes are documented. And that is what makes the defense's questions land differently now, not as sharp attacks but as desperate searches for a gap that isn't there. The prosecutor shifts smoothly, like a hand tightening a knot, and introduces something that changes the texture of the day. Not a new witness, but a new angle on an old detail: the radio, the static, the station schedule. The fact that in 1987, the broadcast the victim listened to had a predictable sign-off, and that sign-off happened at a specific time, and that time sits uncomfortably close to the last confirmed moment the victim was alive. It is not presented as a melodramatic clue. It is presented as a timeline anchor, a faint but stubborn heartbeat in the dead center of a night that has been blurred by decades. An audio specialist testifies gently, explaining how broadcast patterns worked then, how the station's archives confirm the schedule, how a witness statement about the radio being on was once shrugged off but now becomes a clock. The defense objects in the soft, legal way that tries to look principled, but the judge allows it, and the room leans in with the smallest shift of posture, because everyone understands what is happening. The case is being stitched tighter. When you can't show a weapon, you show time. When you can't show a witness who saw the act, you show a sequence that leaves less and less space for innocence to hide. And then comes a moment the courtroom is not prepared for, not because it is sensational, but because it is human. The prosecutor calls someone whose role is not technical, not procedural, but personal. A friend, a colleague, a person who knew the victim's routine not as a police file but as life. The witness takes the stand with a face set in restraint, the kind of restraint built from years of being asked the same questions and receiving no answers. And as they speak, Berlin 1987 becomes less like a distant black and white photograph and more like a room you can step into. They describe the victim's habits in quick strokes: what time they usually left, what route they preferred, how they always carried a certain item, how they disliked certain streets at night. And each detail is ordinary, almost painfully ordinary, and that ordinariness sharpens the horror, because it makes clear how easy it was for the night to swallow them without warning. The prosecutor doesn't linger on grief. They can't. This is court. But they allow just enough space for the room to feel it, and the defense, forced into the uncomfortable position of cross-examining someone who is not an expert but a person, proceeds carefully, trying to strip emotion away, trying to reduce testimony to usefulness. They ask about memory, about the reliability of recollection after decades, about whether the witness could be confusing dates. The witness answers with a quiet anger that never becomes a performance, saying they have repeated these details for years because no one would listen, because repetition was the only way to keep the victim from disappearing twice. Once from the world, and once from record. The suspect sits through it all, face still, eyes low, as if the table is the only stable thing in the room. His attorneys whisper occasionally, but he does not respond. When the witness mentions a location, an intersection, a doorway, a corridor where the victim often paused, his jaw tightens. It is subtle, too subtle for headlines, but in a courtroom where every movement is read, it feels like a flare. During recess, reporters flood the hallway with fragments, each one trying to be the sentence that becomes the day's headline. Radio timeline. Chain of custody holds. Friend describes routine. The words bounce off walls and exit into the city like sparks. Outside, the public devours them. Inside, The family sits in the same position they have sat in for weeks, learning the hard truth that justice, when it arrives late, does not arrive gently. It arrives like someone turning the lights on in a room you have been forced to live in darkness, revealing mess and pain you already knew was there but never had to see this clearly. Back in session, the prosecutor moves to the most dangerous territory of all. The suspect's own words. Not a confession, not a dramatic admission, but recorded fragments from interrogation. Statements where he corrected himself, where he referenced details not public, where he attempted to deny involvement and accidentally revealed familiarity. The audio plays in the courtroom, tinny through speakers, and the sound of his own voice from the station is strangely intimate, as if the room is hearing a private moment that was never meant to be shared. You can feel the defense stiffen because they understand what tone does. Tone makes jurors believe they are hearing truth even when words are careful, and careful words, when replayed, can sound like avoidance. The defense attacks immediately, arguing that people say odd things under stress, that investigators can lead suspects, that confusion is not guilt. They insist the statements prove nothing on their own. The prosecutor does not argue that they prove everything. They argue what is more devastating: that they fit, that they align, that when combined with evidence, these fragments stop being random noise and start being part of a pattern. The case is not one pillar. It is a structure. You can push at one beam, but the building stays standing because there are too many others holding it up. The judge calls for order when the defense grows sharper, and the room quiets again, tension settling into the kind of stillness that makes even breathing feel loud. The suspect's attorneys request another private conference. They huddle with him, shoulders angled like shields. He listens, nods once, and when they return to their seats, there is a change, small, almost invisible, but real. The posture of a man who has been holding the line against time now looks like the posture of a man recalculating how to survive the next hours. He is no longer just enduring. He is anticipating. Later in the day, the prosecutor introduces an exhibit that is not dramatic but chilling in its simplicity. A map. Not a stylized graphic, but a reconstruction of routes, distances, and timing, built from old witness statements, archival records, and the suspect's own known movements. It shows the overlap like a quiet accusation drawn in ink. It shows where the suspect could have been without being noticed. It shows how the city's blind corners created opportunity. And it shows something else, something that makes the air in the room feel thinner. The route is plausible, not fantastical, not dependent on wild assumptions. It is ordinary. It fits the way people actually move. And that is what makes it terrifying. The defense tries to call it narrative invention. They say maps can be made to say anything. The prosecutor counters by pointing to sources, to dates, to the fact that the map is not a story but a synthesis, and synthesis is what cold cases live on, because cold cases do not give you the luxury of a single camera angle. They give you fragments. They give you echoes. And then they ask you to decide whether those echoes belong to chance or to someone who knew exactly what they were doing. As the session winds toward the end of the day, the judge announces scheduling, motions, the next witnesses, and the courtroom exhales, but it is not relief. It is only the brief loosening of a grip before it tightens again. People stand slowly, as if moving too fast might make the weight fall. The family walks out without looking at the suspect. The suspect is led away without looking at the family. Between them, the distance feels immeasurable, filled with years that cannot be crossed. That night, the city outside speaks the case into being again. In cafes, on phones, in quiet apartment kitchens where people pretend they are discussing it academically while actually feeling the private fear that it could have been anyone, that it could have remained hidden forever. The phrase cold case trends, circulates, becomes content, becomes debate, becomes background noise, and yet beneath all of it there is a pulsing awareness. The case is approaching a point where something will break, either the defense's doubt or the suspect's silence. In his cell, under the harsh light that refuses to dim, the suspect sits with his hands clasped, eyes fixed forward, the sound of the courtroom still in his head. His own recorded voice, the map, the witness describing routines that now feel like a spotlight. He shifts once, then again, as if the body is trying to escape what the mind cannot. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closes with a dull final thud, and the sound travels like a warning. The world is moving toward verdict. The machinery is advancing. Time, which once protected him like a thick fog, has cleared. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city is at its most vulnerable, a rumor begins to creep through the edges of legal circles, not yet spoken on camera, not yet printed in headlines, but there, whispered anyway. That the suspect is considering speaking, really speaking, not in fragments, not in denials, but in something closer to surrender, because the structure built around him is getting too tight, because the air is getting too thin, because the cold case, after 36 years, is not just reopened, it is closing in. The rumor doesn't stay a rumor for long, because in a case this old, even whispers have gravity, and gravity pulls everything toward the same place. The moment where silence either hardens into defiance or melts into something that sounds like truth. The courthouse wakes to it like a low electrical charge in the air, the kind you feel before thunder, and by the time the suspect is brought in again, the room is different. Less restless, more alert, as if everyone is holding their breath without realizing they've been doing it for weeks. He sits down with the same controlled movement, but the control is thinner now, stretched too far across too many days, too many exhibits, too many voices describing a night he has tried to compress into nothing. His attorney leans in, whispers, pulls back. The prosecutor watches without expression. The judge's face is neutral, but neutrality in a room like this is its own kind of pressure. Somewhere behind the public benches, the family sits like stone. No longer surprised by pain, only prepared to endure it. The session begins with motions, legal language that sounds harmless until you understand it is the battlefield before the battle, arguments about what can be heard, what can be shown, what must stay locked behind procedure. The defense fights to exclude pieces that, on their own, seem minor, an audio clip, a timeline note, a statement from the interrogation room. Not because those pieces prove everything, but because they do something more dangerous. They shape the story. They make the story feel coherent. And coherence is what jurors remember when details blur. The judge rules with measured firmness, granting small points, denying larger ones, and with each denial the suspect's posture shifts by a millimeter, the body reacting before the mind can mask it. The prosecutor rises again, calm as ever, and calls for the final technical witness. An expert who explains what match truly means, who turns probability into something the room can hold without mystery. The testimony is not dramatic. It is methodical. It repeats what has already been said in different ways, reinforcing, because the prosecution knows this case will not be one on surprise. It will be one on permanence. Then the defense cross-examines, and you can feel the strain behind the questions. They circle the same points again. Time, contamination, degraded material, trying to carve out space where doubt can breathe. The expert answers without ego, without impatience, simply returning to the record, to the repeated tests, to the documented chain, to the fact that error has a signature and this evidence does not carry it. In the public benches, heads tilt. In the jury box, eyes narrow. The room begins to sense it. The defense is running out of new angles. A recess is called, and the hallway fills with movement and murmurs. But the family stays seated, conserving energy like people waiting for a storm to pass. The suspect is led away briefly, and when he returns, something has changed. It's not a collapse. It's not panic. It's a softness around the edges, as if the iron frame he's been leaning on has finally bent under the weight of 36 years. When court resumes, the defense requests a private conference. The judge grants it. Lawyers huddle. The suspect speaks in short, quiet bursts, and from a distance you can't hear the words, but you can see the shape of them: hesitation, bargaining, calculation. The prosecutor watches with the stillness of someone who understands exactly what is happening. A person can endure many things, but the moment their control over narrative slips away, they begin to look for a way to reclaim it. Sometimes that reclamation is truth. Sometimes it's a performance of truth. Either way, it changes the course. The conference ends. Everyone returns to their positions. The judge looks toward the defense. The defense stands, clearing their throat, and makes a request that lands in the room like a dropped object. The defendant wishes to address the court. For a beat, it feels unreal. Then the judge nods slowly, and suddenly the cold case is no longer being spoken about. It is being spoken through. The suspect rises. He grips the edge of the table as if the wood is the only thing keeping him anchored in the present. His voice is low, not theatrical, almost reluctant, and the first words out of his mouth are not an apology, not a confession, but a claim of being misunderstood, an instinctive reach for distance. But the room does not react. The room waits because everyone has heard distance before. What they haven't heard, not in 36 years, is the shape of what he cannot distance himself from. He begins to talk about 1987 in fragments, careful, controlled, as if walking on thin ice. He mentions the city as it was. The fear, the divisions, the way people learned to ignore things to stay safe. He says he was there, yes, in that neighborhood, yes, he knew the area. His attorney shifts slightly, watching the line. The prosecutor's pen moves across paper. The family does not move at all. Then he says a sentence that changes everything. Not because it is graphic, not because it describes violence, but because it admits proximity in a way his defense has been avoiding for weeks. He says he saw the victim that night. He says it was not planned. He says it was an argument, a moment, something that got out of hand. He uses the kind of vague language people use when they are trying to confess without owning the full weight of what they've done. But even vagueness is an earthquake in a case built on silence. The defense looks like they want to interrupt, to pull him back, to stop the bleeding, but the judge allows him to continue, and the suspect does, because once you begin speaking after 36 years, stopping becomes harder than starting. He talks about panic. He talks about fear of consequences. He talks about making decisions in minutes that he then spent decades pretending never happened. The words come out unevenly, like something being dragged from deep water. And yet, even in this moment, he avoids the center. He does not name motive clearly. He does not explain why he was there at that hour. He does not offer the one thing the family has waited for above all else: a complete account. There are holes. There are evasions. There is a clear attempt to present himself as a man who made a mistake, not a man who made a choice. The room feels it. The prosecutor feels it. The family feels it like a bitter taste. The judge stops him gently, reminding him that this is not the time for narrative, that testimony belongs in proper form, that his words will be considered but must be weighed. The suspect sits back down, breathing heavier than before, the act of speaking having taken something out of him he cannot reclaim. His attorney leans in again, urgent now. The prosecutor scribbles notes, already building the next move. Because the moment he spoke, he did two things at once. He cracked his own defense and he opened new questions. If he saw the victim, where exactly? If it was an argument, what caused it? If panic followed, what actions did he take afterward? And most haunting of all, why, after decades, can he still not bring himself to fill in the missing pieces completely? The prosecution rises after another brief pause, voice steady, and addresses the court in the controlled manner of someone who refuses to be dazzled by partial truth. They do not treat his statement as redemption. They treat it as confirmation, one more element aligning with evidence, one more proof that the structure holds. They emphasize that his words, however incomplete, place him in the orbit he denied. They emphasize that out of hand is not an explanation. It is a shield. They make it clear that the court is not here to evaluate regret. It is here to evaluate responsibility. The defense responds quickly, attempting to frame the statement as evidence of humanity, as a man overwhelmed, as someone who should not be judged as harshly after so much time. They talk about age, about frailty, about remorse. But the room is no longer listening the same way, because age is not innocence, and time does not dilute harm. Time only spreads it out, letting the damage seep into decades. The day ends with scheduling for closing arguments. The judge's voice is calm, procedural, as if they are discussing paperwork rather than the collision of past and present. People stand. Chairs scrape. The family rises slowly, and for the first time in weeks, there is a visible tremor, small but real. Not because they got everything they wanted, but because they got enough to reopen the wound in a new way. Partial truth is its own cruelty. It gives the mind something to grip while still denying it the full shape of reality. Outside, headlines explode within minutes. Suspect speaks. Cold case defendant admits seeing victim. Partial admission shocks courtroom. The story spreads fast, faster than nuance can travel, and the city reacts as cities do. Some declaring it over, some declaring it unreliable, some suddenly remembering where they were in 1987, as if proximity to time could become proximity to meaning. That night, the suspect sits alone again, and the cell feels smaller than before, because now his own words are trapped with him. Speaking didn't free him. It only brought the past fully into the present, where it can no longer be edited. In the courthouse, lights go out one by one, but the case does not dim. It hums in the dark like the old radio in the apartment, static that refuses to settle, because even now, after an arrest, after testimony, after a statement that cracked the silence, something remains unfinished. The cold case is closing, yes, but it is not closing cleanly. Not yet. The final day arrives without romance, without ceremony, and that is what makes it terrifying, because the end of a story like this is never a cinematic slam of doors. It's the slow tightening of a circle until there is nowhere left to look but straight at what happened, and the courthouse feels less like a building and more like a machine that has been running for weeks, grinding 36 years into a verdict, turning memory, evidence, procedure, and pain into something the law can name. Outside, the city is awake early. Cameras are already set. People gather not because they expect spectacle, but because they sense history about to seal itself shut. Inside, the suspect is let in and he looks older than he did yesterday, as if speaking even partially has accelerated time, as if words ripped something loose that can't be reattached. His face is controlled, but the control is different now, no longer the control of someone confident in silence, but the control of someone trying to hold together a failing structure. His attorney whispers again. He nods once. The family sits, still, eyes forward, the kind of stillness that is not calm but containment. They have waited too long for this moment to waste it on emotion that might collapse them before the end. The judge calls the room to order, and the sound is crisp, final, like the click of a lock. Closing arguments begin. The prosecutor stands and speaks with the urgency of someone who knows the facts are heavy enough without decoration. They do not shout. They do not dramatize. They rebuild the story the way a careful hand rebuilds a shattered object. Piece by piece, showing how each fragment fits, how time did not destroy the truth, it only scattered it. They bring the jury back to 1987, to the apartment, to the radio static, to the cup gone cold, to a life cut out of routine without warning. They remind them how the case froze, how it became a cold case not because it didn't matter, but because the world moved on and the evidence couldn't speak loudly enough until it could. They walk through the chain of custody like a spine, emphasizing that this case did not depend on one fragile claim but on documented continuity. They revisit the forensic testimony. Repeated testing, consistency, controls. They revisit the witness who carried a splinter of memory for decades. They revisit the map, the overlap of routes, the ordinary plausibility of the suspect's proximity. They return to the interrogation fragments, the slips, the familiarity with details that should have been unreachable. And then they do something that hits harder than any accusation. They bring up his own words, not as a confession of everything, but as a confession of enough. He placed himself in the orbit. He admitted contact. He framed it as a moment out of hand. But the prosecutor refuses to let that phrase soften what it is. A choice, an act, a life altered forever. The prosecutor's voice stays steady as they say the hardest truth in the room. Time does not erase responsibility. Time does not wash a crime clean. Time only gives the guilty a longer stretch of ordinary life and gives the victim's family a longer stretch of unanswered nights. They look at the jury and ask them not for vengeance, not for emotion, but for recognition of what the evidence shows when you stop looking away. Then the defense stands and the atmosphere shifts again, because the defense has only one weapon left: doubt. They speak of the danger of certainty after decades. They emphasize the fragility of memory, the evolution of forensic science, the possibility, however small, of mistakes layered across time. They say the prosecution is asking the jury to build a bridge across 36 years and walk over it as if it were solid ground. They remind them that a man's life now hangs on evidence that was once shelved, on witnesses who are older, on a system that admits it could not solve the case when it was fresh. They attempt to reframe the suspect's statement as desperation, as confusion, as a man crushed by pressure who spoke because silence was suffocating him, not because guilt compelled him. They talk about age. They talk about diminished capacity. They talk about remorse, about how the law should not confuse tragedy with intent. They repeat reasonable doubt like a spell, trying to make the room feel uncertainty again. But something has changed, not in the evidence, in the air. Because once a cold case shifts from mystery to confrontation, the room learns to hear avoidance differently. Words like maybe and possibly begin to sound like smoke, not like substance. And the suspect's partial admission sits in the center of everything like a stone. The defense can argue contamination, but contamination does not explain why he placed himself near the victim. The defense can argue memory decay, but memory decay does not explain why he recognized details that were never public. The defense can argue time, but time is not an alibi. Time is only distance, and distance is not innocence. The judge instructs the jury, voice flat, procedural, reminding them what they must weigh and how. The words are formulaic, but they land with finality. Then the jury leaves, and suddenly the room becomes a waiting chamber again, the kind of waiting that feels like holding a fragile object over a hard floor, knowing that if it drops, it will shatter in a way you cannot repair. The family sits, breathing shallow. The suspect sits, posture stiff, eyes fixed forward as if staring at the wall can stop time from moving. Lawyers whisper. Reporters outside speculate. The city holds its breath in thousands of separate rooms. Hours stretch. Time does what it always does in moments like this. It becomes louder. Each minute carries weight. Each sound in the hallway feels like it could be the one. A door closing. Footsteps approaching. A distant murmur of voices. When the jury finally returns, the room stands. The movement is automatic, but the emotion is not. It is a rising tide, pressing against ribs, tightening throats. The suspect's hands grip the table again. The family's shoulders tense. The judge's face remains unreadable, but even unreadable faces carry weight in a moment like this. The foreperson reads the verdict, and the words land like the end of a long fall. Guilty. Not with celebration. Not with relief that wipes everything clean. Guilty with a heaviness that feels like the final page of a book written in ink that never fades. The family does not erupt. They do not collapse in cinematic sobs. They exhale slow, as if their bodies have been holding air for decades. A hand reaches for another hand. A head bows. Somewhere in that quiet, something shifts. Not healing, not closure, but an acknowledgement that the world has finally spoken the word it refused to speak for 36 years. The suspect does not react dramatically. No screaming, no outburst. His face tightens, then empties the way a person looks when the last possible version of the future disappears. He stares forward, blinking slowly. For a moment, he looks less like a monster and more like a man watching the consequences of his own life arrive late but intact. The law moves on to sentencing procedures, to dates, to paperwork. The machinery continues, indifferent to meaning. Outside, the headlines explode instantly. Berlin 1987 cold case reopened. Suspect convicted after 36 years. Shocks community. Justice at last. But the family steps into that noise like people stepping into rain after surviving a fire. Cameras shout questions. Microphones extend like weapons. They give little. They owe the public nothing. Their grief is not content. Their relief is not entertainment. They walk away with the quiet dignity of people who have lived too long with pain to let strangers define its shape. And still, even after the verdict, the case refuses to become clean. Because the verdict answers one question, who, but it does not answer all the others. It does not explain motive in a way that satisfies the mind. It does not rewind time. It does not restore the years stolen, the birthdays missed, the family photographs with empty spaces. It does not undo the night the radio hummed static in a room where silence swallowed a life. In the weeks that follow, Berlin keeps moving, but the community carries a new awareness. That some crimes can hide in plain sight for decades, that justice can arrive late, and that late justice is both miracle and warning. The case becomes a story told to younger detectives as proof that persistence matters, that evidence can outlive forgetfulness, that a cold case is not dead, it is waiting. But for those who lived inside the case, the ending is quieter than any headline. The family returns home, and the house looks the same, but it is not the same. A chapter has closed, but the book remains. They sit with the strange sensation of finally knowing, of having a verdict stamped onto a wound that has shaped their lives. Some nights will still be hard. Some mornings will still feel heavy. Grief does not accept court decisions as medicine. It only acknowledges them as truth. And somewhere, in a room far away, the old file that once gathered dust is now marked differently. Not cold case, not unsolved. The label changes, but the shadow remains, because the true power of this story isn't the conviction. It's the reminder that time can delay justice, but it cannot fully bury it. That a city can reinvent itself, walls can fall, decades can pass, and still, a single night can reach forward and grab the present by the throat.
Berlin, 1987.
A disappearance that became a cold case. 36 years of silence. And then the door finally opened, the past stepped out, and the community learned the most unsettling truth of all. Some endings don't bring peace. They bring clarity. And clarity, after decades of darkness, can be its own kind of haunting.